want to welcome you to this presentation talking about performance as a focus for what we do. And we'll talk about why that is and what does that mean we should do. But I want to start by asking you, the audience, what is performance? What is it? What are we talking about here when we use that word? What do you mean by it when you use that word? And please use the chat for your response. And in general, if I ask a question in the middle of the screen, it is for you to respond to. So delivery of results, the ability to do something. Very interesting, Karen. Yeah. And answer, it is results we're looking for. But from an ability to do something, behaviors that are needed on that job, yes, behaviors, not just knowledge. Competent completion of tasks. Exactly. What I'm seeing here, and thank you for your responses, are a focus on actually accomplishing things and doing things. The performance of tasks to produce outputs, render services that meet stakeholder requirements. Classic. That is probably a well-refined answer over years and decades of making sure that we have clear definitions about what we're doing. And exactly, this is, to me, what matters. Performance is a focus on doing. We will find out, we know, that the ability to know stuff doesn't necessarily mean the ability to do things. And what's going to make a difference to your organization is not the ability for people, by and large, not the ability for people to recite facts, but the ability to do things they need to do that they may not be doing now. And it is for outcomes, as was measured, several people mentioned, the delivery of results, competent completion of the tasks, behaviors. This is that meet stakeholder requirements. It needs to be measurable. We don't know if it's happening if it isn't measurable. Positive, and I don't mean positive in the sense of an increase, because an increase in errors wouldn't be a positive outcome. What I mean is positive outcomes, whether it's an increase in things we want or a decrease in things we don't want. It's an outcome that's beneficial to the organization, and it is behavior change in the sense that it means we're either doing things we couldn't do before or doing them correctly when we weren't doing them correctly in the past. And again, this emphasis, it is not on knowing. Knowing isn't the difference that's going to make a critical change in what our organizations can do. By and large, there are times when there's stuff we have to know, but too often we revert to that and say, oh, well, if they know it, they will change their behavior. And that's grounded in a legacy belief that we are formal, logical, reasoning beings. And if you give us new information, we'll change our behavior. And that would be lovely if it were true. It's just not. Empirically, we know that we are not formal, logical, reasoning beings. We can be under the right circumstances. In many cases, we need people to perform even before they think. I remember the case of pilots. They need them to respond to emergencies before their conscious practices kick in because they don't have time for it. But even when we do, we often revert, as Daniel Kahneman talked about, system 1 and system 2. System 2 is our effortful conscious reasoning, but too often revert to the system 1, which is just our automatic responses, which is fine when they're well developed, but it's not fine when they're not. And yet we revert to it. So we want to make sure we're reverting appropriately when appropriate. At the bottom line, it's about people doing better than they have been. That is under our control, things we can do. So this is what performance is, in my mind. What does this mean for us doing things? It means, for one thing, any means to success. So we tend to throw courses at every situation, and courses can be the right answer when we have a skill gap that there are things we need to be able to do that we're not doing now or can't do now, or there are things we need to be doing that we are doing wrongly now. But we can also meet performance requirements with job aids. There are times when it doesn't make sense to put it in the head, but instead we put it in the world. We can, if it happens very infrequently, it's going to be really hard to get people to do it. Look at all the training, again, pilots do to be able to perform in those moments when they are faced with a situation they hadn't expected. They train for situations they hope never to see. And yet it's really critical. Most of the times, most of our jobs we're training people for, people won't die if we don't get it right. But if it's really infrequent, don't put it in the head. Provide guidance in the world, particularly if it's not time critical. So we can use job aids in many instances to improve performance without trying to put it in the head. And we should respect and reflect this in our work. So then it takes a process. That's what we are trying to do. How do we get there? And the process starts with analysis. And this to me is where we dig down, and this is to me is also where we don't do enough. And if you look at gurus of performance consulting, and that includes Guy Wallace, who's here, bless him, for showing up. This involves going down deep, and we'll unpack this a little bit more, but you have to do the analysis up front. You can't just take what somebody tells you is the situation you need to fix. You need to validate that. And if you do this, in many instances, you'll find the actual problem isn't what you're told it is, because the stakeholders we respond to don't always understand learning or performance. And we need to make sure we get it. And then when we've analyzed what we need to do, we need a design process appropriate for the intervention we've decided to work. Designing job aids is very different than designing courses. And if we're designing one or the other, we should use the appropriate design processes. And then there's the subsequent steps, implementation, evaluation. But the process matters, and analysis is one of the things up front that we really have to focus on to get it right. And then we want an ecosystem to support appropriate performance. Courses and job aids shouldn't exist independent of each other, and they shouldn't be hard to find. They need to be available when and where we need it. So we need an integrated ecosystem that is oriented towards our performers' perspective, not ours or the silos of the business, but from the performers' needs. And it's got to be comprehensive. It's got to include all the possible solutions we need to be able to effectively do our jobs. It can't skip some things. We have to be understanding all the barriers to performance and making sure we're addressing them either through our efforts or assisting others to understand what they need to do differently to make it work better. And Guy Wallace points out in his book, The L&D Pivot Point, and his other works, that many times the barriers to performance are things that are out of L&D's purview. There just aren't sufficient people, or there aren't sufficient resources, or there motivations out, that are rewarding things that aren't the best performance we should. And that may be out of our control, but once we identify that, we can pass it off. And then when things are fixed, we can come in and work on it better. So I've hinted at the answer to this already, but what does analysis for performance mean? Again, a picture, a question in the middle of the screen is for you, and I encourage you to use the chat to respond. But what analysis would you do if you were trying to understand and improve the performance of individuals in their roles and their tasks? So how do you analyze what people need to do, are doing, measure performance before and after intervention? Well, absolutely. You need to know what they're doing now, and you need to know afterwards. Might you also need to know what that new evaluation afterwards should be? Discussion and analysis of influences, bottlenecks, stakeholder perception, what the best people do, clear understanding what behavior wanted that not happening. Yeah, Melody, what is it that they should be doing that they're not now? And what are the bottlenecks or that are keeping us from getting there? And what is the reasons why that's happening? What exactly is the gap we need to fill? Yeah. Is, oh, I need a course on sales. Well, what's the problem in sales? Is it taking too long to close deals? Is our hit rate not sufficient? Are we getting rejected by better competitors? Where are the barriers to our supports? Looking at the process and its outputs and all the enablers required to meet the requirements and deal with the constraints in the performance context. So what should be the output? What isn't? What is the gap between the output and what we should be doing? And what constraints might be keeping us from achieving the outputs we know we need? And this is, by the way, for the things we know we need to do or have identified that we need to do. So to me, there's a gap. We need to identify the gap, and that was mentioned by several of you in the chat. What is the need to change? What needs to change? We shouldn't be focusing our efforts on things that are okay. If we're asked for a course on sales and we talk about the product, that may not be the barrier. The product knowledge may not be what our gap is. And if we develop information about that, we're wasting resources. We need to focus on where the change is, what is the need to change, and then we need to understand what's called the root cause. Why aren't we doing it to the level we should be doing it at? Because if we don't know the cause, we could be addressing a cause that's not the one that's causing the problem. As I suggested earlier, it may be that they don't have the resources they need. They don't have enough people to write the proposals that they have the opportunities to write for. That's not something necessarily that L&D can do. That may be a talent management issue about hiring. Or it could be that they don't have the templates to write proposals into that would make it faster and make sure they hit all the elements. It may be that they don't know how to write proposals. Some of those are things that L&D can address and some of those aren't. So you need to understand the root cause so you can design an intervention that will address that. What we can do, what L&D can do, what we can do as learning designers, and we may have to help Debbie in the chat says may have to help participants to unlearn old bad behaviors that we may have to learn over. We don't unlearn, and I note that you put it in quotes, so I'm not holding you to that. But yeah, we may need to have people learn to do things in a new way, as well as learn new things, which is a distinction that's important. But what interventions will address this? Could we put information in the world? By the way, even though it's not just if you build it, it is good for performance support as it is with courses, it still generally is easier to design a performance support tool than to design an effective course. So ideally, we put it in the world when we can. We only put it in the head when we have to. But as was suggested also in the chat, we need to know metric, how we'll know when we've succeeded. How do we know when we're done with our intervention, that we've identified a problem and a root cause, and that we've determined that it's an intervention that's within our control that we can do something about. But we shouldn't assume we'll get it right the first time. If we build it, it is not good. Not necessarily. The learning science prescriptions have gaps in them that don't address necessarily our specific situation. So we need to make a first best guess based on those learning science prescriptions, but then we need to test it and refine it because people are complex. Let's make sure that we're addressing this the way we know how. Okay, that's on the analysis side. we need to have, and we have processes and practices that will help us do this, but what does design for performance mean? If we've analyzed and created, identified an intervention we need, whether it's course or job aid, what does design for that performance mean? And I've already given a hint again on this, getting ahead of myself, but what does design for performance mean? How do we design to achieve performance? Not design for knowledge, but design for performance. Are there nuances there? Unpack, what does that mean we should do? And again, question in the middle, use the chat to respond. But I'm looking to see what you guys think it means to design for performance. Consider the workplace environment. Yeah, absolutely. Look at the context. What will support the team? Meet them where they are. Provide safe places for practice. Interesting. So practice is implicit there, and safe places to practice, realistic scenarios for practice, and feedback. Well, absolutely. One of the things we don't do properly is we just tend to say right or wrong, and the feedback is critical to help us refine it. Turns out when we look at the analysis of how our brains work and they're continual trying to predict the world, feedback helps us understand whether we've gotten it right or wrong. Start with the needed behavior change and work backwards. Absolutely, Robin. Backwards design is because it may be a mix of courses and job aids together, and you should figure out what the job aid should be and then design the course to incorporate it if you are doing that. Plenty of opportunities to practice authentically with reinforcing corrective feedback. Yeah, practice is the critical element I will suggest that we miss when it comes to performance. Too often we present information, we test that information, which was good if we need to be able to recite information, but that's not going to lead us to new abilities to do. And in fact, what you say, authentic practice with reinforcing and corrective feedback. Debbie says, use brain science to hit opportunities to develop pathways. They're strong in access schema, lots of practice and feedback. Right, we want to make sure we're accessing and developing models about how to perform that guide us in those moments, what should be automated and what should be consciously evaluated. Safe spaces, again and again, talking about effective practice, which is wonderful. I love to hear it. Define what performance means in terms of business and the efforts required to achieve them. Designed to make people capable of putting these efforts. Yeah, we want to make sure that people are performing. Our metrics should say what that performance should look like, and then we should figure out the interventions to need it. Absolutely. So it brought up a lot of things. We talked more about course design here, but realize job aid design. We have both job aid design and course design. And as I suggested earlier, they're different. They're different, and we need to recognize that in what we do. So job aid design is not for learning. I've heard people talk about, workflow learning, and that's what learning in the workflow. And yet you should continue to perform. That's not learning. Learning requires taking time out, as was suggested in the chat, feedback and reflection to incorporate it. But many times we don't want people to learn. For instance, I fixed my dryer. I looked up a video that taught me about identifying the problem and replacing the part. And a day later, I couldn't have told you what I did. I can't even tell you. I can vaguely remember where in the dryer it was. I can't remember what I did or what was the problem and what I replaced to fix it. I just remember that I did. And that's good. The dryer works. I didn't have to learn anything. I was able to succeed because it was performance support. My cognitive gap was, in this case, not having sufficient knowledge. It provided the knowledge so that I could succeed. And then also worry about usability. Let me go back briefly. I want to talk a bit more about cognitive gaps. There are a number of different gaps in our architecture. Wonderful as it is, allowing us to have people from around the world, from Guatemala and Canada and Singapore, coming together to be able to talk together today. But despite that wonderful architecture, we have gaps and flaws that we have to work to overcome. We have limited working memory, and we have perceptual memory that can dissipate really quickly. And it takes effort and practice and feedback to cement learning. So we have all these gaps in our architecture, and we have tools to overcome them. But we need to figure out what gap is preventing this performance and identify this appropriate approach, and then make it usable. Make it usable so that I've seen job aids that had all the great support, but people couldn't figure out how to use them, and they weren't. And they were also designed to be followed rigorously, which led to a really bad experience from the point of the customer, because you would get this sort of rote language instead of people adapting it, and it hadn't been built to be adapted and used as people developed capability. So job aid design is one thing. Course design is different. And what came through in many of your responses was the need for meaningful practice in a context. Abstract practice doesn't transfer well. Contextual practice with the right selection of contexts leads you to abstract and be able to transfer that learning to the situations you'll face with an appropriate level of challenge. It can't be too simple or it's boring. It can't be too hard or it's frustrating. At the right place, it's the right pitch for both the experience and the learning. And as was mentioned repeatedly, feedback, the feedback that tells you about what you did wrong and why, and what the right answer is, without reflecting on you, just reflecting on your performance. Minimal content. Too much content gets in the way. Cognitive load is overwhelmed. And what we need to do is focus on the models that will give us a basis to predict the outcome of different paths of action, so we can choose the right one for this situation. And examples that show those models in context. It turns out, particularly for novices, seeing a worked example before you do practice is more effective than just giving you practice. But you have to know when to do it and how to do it. And then don't neglect the emotional side of the courses. You want your introduction to get people to go, oh, I do need this. If they don't have that sort of recognition, the learning isn't going to stick. They need to recognize that this is relevant to them. And then you need to maintain that with the appropriate challenge and the minimal content, and then close that experience off. Don't just leave them hanging. Acknowledge their contributions and more. So there's a lot that goes into these two designs. And again, they're very different. Know how to do both and know when to do both. So for example, this is two different performance job aids. One is sort of identifying a checklist on the left for how to isolate and separate the sick, so that how to make sure. This was from the days of COVID, and a company had asked Upside for assistance in helping their employees implement their practices and policies about it. And one was how to keep a person isolated if they did test positive. Another one is when to worry about emergencies. So if you have somebody who you're worried about, you could go through this list and see if any of these situations was there and trigger an action. And they're different, but they have visual design. They're supportive of ensuring you check the important things. So you want a job aid. And then there's times when there's courses, in this case, identifying fire safety, and they would have you go through and identify potential risks and act on them. So it's putting you in the position of a fire warden, asking you to make the decisions a fire warden needs to make, as a way to ensure that you develop the capability if you've desired. And they had outcomes even that after this course, they found that more people were volunteering to be fire wardens, because this made it concrete and tangible, and the value came through because it was designed properly. So you've analyzed it, you designed. What does evaluation for performance mean? How do you evaluate whether people have appropriately performed? Again, question in the middle, that's for you in the chat. And by the way, I'm monitoring the chat, as you probably have been able to see. Feel free to throw questions, issues, or challenges in here. As you think through this, we can talk about those too. But right now, let's do that in between when I'm asking questions. But let's talk about, what does evaluation for performance mean? Is it different than evaluation for knowledge? Can people meet the performance objectives that drove the learning objectives? Can they perform? test performance on actual tasks with levels of success, right? So you can actually ask them to perform. You can do that in a learning experience or afterwards. You can compare performance indicators before and after and measure any change. Yeah, you can do a before and after, although sometimes people argue you don't need the before because you shouldn't have developed it unless you know there's a gap. All you need to do is make sure they now meet the requirements. Easier to evaluate sales performance compared to other roles for me. Well, Christine, that may be because people do track sales outcomes. Sales people are very rigorous about all the metrics. And we may not do that as much in other places. And yet I would suggest that there are, when we break down, I was having this discussion with somebody in a conversation, and they were talking about how they were dealing with soft skill things like leadership or team dynamics. And I said, well, break it down. What makes good team dynamics? And look at the specific behaviors, and you may be able to assess those. Oh boy, manager pull through discussions, in discussions, and one-to-one as well as observation. Yes, actually, Melanie, that's good. You know, if people are performing like sales people on the floor, their manager can observe them, or in meetings, don't have somebody go alone, maybe have somebody pre-acted. Of course, you can ask anybody who interacts. If a salesperson goes by themselves to deal with the customer, afterwards you might see what feedback you get from the customer about it. I think Robin says, I think having before and after helps to demonstrate things like return on investment and return on expectation. Yes, Rob, I was talking in the principled abstract. There may be other metrics that are affected, key performance indicators in the business that says, you know, since your intervention, we're getting higher customer ratings, which was the target, and you don't necessarily have to have a before and after, but you're absolutely right that having that can be useful to demonstrate the benefit of what you're doing. You also need, Debbie says, you need to have a picture of what the performance should look like to be able to evaluate it. Yeah, that's why it should be ideally observable, measurable, so that you can check it. And Lisa, sorry if I mispronounced that too. So assessment behaviors are demonstrated and outcomes in alignment with the goal metrics established during analysis. Yes, basically you want to say, what should they be able to do? And now can they do it? And it's performance, and it may be, again, performance on a final assessment, a simulated performance, and it may be both. You do that at the end of the learning, say, can they do it? And then they say, are they doing it in the workplace afterwards? That's an important part. What if it takes too long for the task to be performed? It's impossible to test every participant's performance. Eva, if it takes too long, you're going to have to break up the training, and then you can break up the task into component parts and look at those component parts first. And if they're able to do the component parts and put them in together in conjunction, you might argue that then have the experience. Markers, not markets. Apologies for the typo. No worries. All our typo checkers aren't always going to be work when they're two words that are both legitimate words. They just mean different things. So I want to suggest that first you have to have the metric that came from your analysis. There should be a metric that you're looking at. And formatively, we talk about formative and summative assessment. Formative assessment is saying, assessing, are we getting there? Is the intervention working? And it's iterative. You test and you say, oh, well, we are getting some improvement, but it's not the amount of improvement we need. Why isn't it working? And you tweak something and then you do it again. So you iterate and focus on the core performance first, the core practice, and even the final practice, and then work backwards, which was mentioned from the point of view of an analysis, but it's also for your design. David Merrill now talks about pebble in a pond, and Michael Allen's SAM, and Megan Torrance's Llama. These are all design processes that talk about prototyping the core thing first and iterating. And Kathy Moore's Map It, similarly. All of these approaches are trying to balance rigor with expediency and say, well, if you get the core practice first and test that, then you can address it working your way forward until you believe you've addressed it. And then, as I was suggesting, having that before and after can demonstrate that you've had that impact. But you need to see, is it persisting in the workplace? So after the learning experience is great, okay, then now they can do it. Are they continuing to do it? Because one of the things that happens is our behavior tends to atrophy over time. We backslide to what we were doing before unless we're proactive and working on it. And then check our organizational outcomes. Are we getting those business improvements that are what ends up being the critical difference of what we're talking about? So metrics, formative evaluation, we should prototype the core practice and test to see that people understand it and can do it, and then work the rest of the practice so that they're developing those component skills and the minimum necessary models and examples to support that performance is the process, and then you summatively evaluate it. Okay, so I hinted at this before, but people don't typically perform one task with just being trained on it. They tend to have a number of tasks in their job description. How do we support all of them? I want to suggest it's a performance ecosystem, but what to you, if I say we need to have a performance ecosystem, what am I talking about? What do you think I mean when I say we need a performance ecosystem? Encourage communication on the job, training from peers. Okay, so part of the ecosystem is the people around you that you work with and can continue to develop each other as you go forward. Christine says, checkpoints design in the work process, follow up by the managers. So you're talking about making sure that it's not just a course, but that we're following up beyond that to ensure that as people perform, we're checking to make sure they're continuing to do it and maybe even improving them as they go forward as well. Melody says a series of materials and performance support assets to help stack behaviors and show how they interact and overlap. Make it visible from leadership on down. Okay, so you're creating the resources, but then you're also looking at how they work together and taking a top-down perspective. Pooja talks about it's not just about the learners, but everyone adding value to the learning system, including technology, processes, and other resources. Yeah, that's closer to the notion I had, but I'm loving these other descriptions because I'm finding them resonant and providing different perspectives on the overall performance. Guy talks about people and other resources that are readily accessible that enable one to perform to standard or need. So yeah, to me, I have meant in general resource. Oh, Raman adds, does that mean that everything has to support the needed behavior, including environmental aspects like processes, team composition, et cetera? The motivational aspects, rewarding the required behavior and not rewarding the opposite behavior? Absolutely, Robin. I think recognizing that performance is a complex outcome of an environment. And Guy Wallace, in his book, The LAP Point, talks about all the different environmental factors as well as individual factors that can influence your ability to perform. And so if people say, oh, that's not the way they do it here, what you heard in that classroom, that's theory stuff. Here we do it this practical way. Suddenly you're undermining the approach. Or you might not have the tools that you need to hand, or they're hard to find, and that slows you down. You may have a team that is non-functional. Not everybody has the skills that they're supposed to have to be able to play their roles in the overall task. I think about Ed Hutchins talking about distributed cognition and how navigating a ship is distributed across representations and people. And if somebody isn't capable of doing their job, suddenly the whole navigation task falls down. So yes, I do think, and it's also how do we develop people at different stages? So we have the new people doing the basic tasks and the more advanced people handling the things that they can't. But how do we develop those new people to become those, as those people become experts and those experts, retire? How do we keep that pipeline going? Oh, I think it is all of those things together. So it's comprehensive. So it's including the right atmosphere, the right development, the right tools to hand. So you have the right tool for the job, but you folks have brought up much more, and I really appreciate shaking up my thinking. I recognize, agree with all you say, and yet I've prematurely converged on this simpler definition. So thank you. But it's also integrated in that it's seamless. It doesn't feel like I have to go over to this tool for that and this tool for that. It feels like I'm focused on the task and the tools are to hand. One of the problems too often is I ask, do you have portals? And everybody in the audience raises their hand. Do you have more than one? And everybody raises their hand. They have multiple portals across the organization. There's not a federated search. So you have to go to this portal for that tool and that portal for the other tool. It doesn't make sense. You need to find a way to bring the tools to the practitioner from their role so that they have the tools they need for their job. Hernan asks, what about environmental barriers that occur at work and that derail or prevent the transfer of learning at work? How do we identify them and how do we eliminate or improve them so that the transfer happens? Oh my goodness. That's what performance consulting is about, is looking at all those factors and identifying. There's a whole process indicated in Guy Wallace's book, The L&D Pivot Point, which I wasn't going to mention, but in there they talk about identifying all the barriers, got a comprehensive list of different environmental factors, and you need to assess those, because if those are happening and preventing the performance, that's not out in L&D's purview, and yet that is about performance. So, until it becomes a performance and development department, which I've argued for, but that's a separate issue, you do need to be able to at least identify those, and you go through and say, you ask about these specific factors to your teams of SMEs. You work with them in a group. That's something Roger Schank talked about, Norman Beer talked about, Guy Wallace talks about. It's better if you bring them in a group and you go through these things and say, what about these factors? Are they a barrier? And Guy says, I like to challenge the client and key stakeholders that transfer is really on them. Yeah, I think that's right. But the issue is here, we have methods to identify them that may involve just, we can go out and contextually explore the environment and observe performance, and we should. One of the things that's happened in interface design, way back when I was a grad student, and I hate to tell you how long ago that was, but they were already talking about situated and participatory design, where you go in and look at the people performing. One of the clues there was if people had Post-its on the monitor to help them remember things, sorry about that. I must have made the wrong gesture. With those Post-its on the screen, they didn't realize that they had a problem because they'd found a workaround solution. But if you went in and saw those, you could tell that that was a barrier that they were finding solutions for, but that was a bad interface design. And the same thing with learning and performance. You go in and observe them, you can see the barriers that they may not even recognize or acknowledge. And you want to triangulate. You want to find multiple ways of looking at this. You talk to the people about the barriers they face, you observe them, you do some inference about what you might expect. So I think it's an important question, Hernan, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right. But you need to identify and eliminate those practices, and that may be even more important. And as is mentioned in Guy's book, sometimes you put the learning and job aid development on hold and solve those problems, and you may not even need to come back and do the learning because those barriers were the ones that were preventing performance. And so whoever's responsible for those fixes those, and then you come back and say, do we still have a performance problem and do we need it? So that's what a performance perspective suggests, and you're absolutely right. But there are practices, and I recommend reading about them to find out. And role task focused. focus on what people need to do, not on who they are or what department they work on. It's not the silo, and they shouldn't have to go over to the engineering for the product info if they're in sales, and over to the sales listing of the customers for X. It should be brought together, integrated. And I realize that's an ideal world, and you would expect your IT department to be partners with us, and they should be. Now, I also asked this question of audiences: how many of you hate your IT department? Most everybody raised their hand. How many of you hate when the network goes down? Everybody raises their hand. That's their job. And you want them to do what? So you have to work with them, recognizing they need to be worried about security and reliability and maintainability. Yet they should also know that they need to be continually creating an environment that's optimal for the organization, but recognize their barriers when you work with them. So, and there was much more that came up in the chat on this about also making sure that you have the people resources available at hand. That can be a barrier. Experts may resist being called upon to help other people develop when they want to do their own work. How do you find ways to make that manageable? How do you reward them for that? So in ways that they feel recognized. And it goes beyond just, cognitive learning design, the emotional aspect, motivation theory, self-determination theory with autonomy, competence, and relatedness play a role in making this work as well. And it's hard, but aligning all these really makes a difference. There is evidence in the work of Laura Overton when she was working with Towards Maturity. They found that the top performing organizations had things aligned. And similarly, Laura Bassi and her scorecard was finding when you worked on a richer picture of making people successful, you got better outcomes. And from her point, for investment in the organizations, you did better on the stock market if you're investing in companies that met these good criteria. Okay, you've got a need for analysis, you've got a need for design, a need for evaluation, a need for an ecosystem. What is a performance strategy that can get you there? What are the elements of a performance-focused strategy? Again, question, respond in the chat. But how do you get there? So you want to have all these things. How do you get there? What are the elements that will that you need to focus on? What are the components? How do you end up aligning all these elements? On some systems actually show you, that people are typing or not, but I hope you're queuing up elegant responses to this, because it is an important question as well to talk about. What is a strategy for performance? What might you shift in terms of your L&D strategy to be an impact and performance strategy, not just a learning strategy? Nothing's come up except build into processes. Well, Melody says communication with stakeholders. Absolutely. Communication is an important part of a strategy regarding how training and performance initiatives will be managed going forward. Templated processes. Yes, it does get baked into processes, and it does come into the communication you have around. Christine, yeah, building into the process. Debbie, a large plan that includes training, support tools, support relationships, and best practice coaching. Absolutely. In the long term, a performance strategy says this is what it looks like. In general strategy, sort of saying where do we want to go and where are we now and how do we get there and what's our plan? And it is a plan that says starts focusing. But I think communication is going to be critical up front to let people know not just that you're shifting, but where you're shifting and why, so they can get on board. It's all inclusive and includes many internal and external partners across the enterprise, beyond, but including L&D. Yeah, when I think of strategy, I think of your plan, your governance, your metrics, So you have metrics on your strategy as well. How do you know you're getting closer to having a performance focus in your L&D department? Absolutely right that it's multi-element, multi-practice, but knowing this and putting it in place is an important element. So I suggest, but you need to have metrics that are, how are we evaluating? And interestingly, I heard somebody who knew better, now I'm suddenly drawing a blank on who it was, say, you don't have to, not all of the projects you do in L&D have to be focused on performance, at least to start. Pick one or two that where you're working with eager adopters who get it and want to work with you to do this. Not everybody in the organization is going to be ready for this, but work with those people who are, find them, talk to them, get them on board, and do projects, a few projects with them that have this different approach. That's part of the strategy, but that includes measuring how many projects are we doing with this focus might be an important metric that you have, and how fast are we getting there? I suggest internal first. To be focused on performance, start within the L&D department itself. So how are we becoming focused on performance? How are we measuring ourselves? How are we developing ourselves? How are we creating a culture of performance and supporting one another? How are we sharing what we're doing so others can improve what we do? Folks, get it working internally first, then take it outside. As I mentioned, early adopters, go out there and find those people who are understanding, get what you're trying to do and care about it. And whoever it is, whether it's operations or sales or marketing or any other group, find out who's on board and has a project, and you will have, stakeholders come to you for different projects. Talk to them about this approach, see which ones are willing to give it a go, and do those, the new way, while the other ones continue in the old way. People aren't, but get those success stories, back to the mention of, measure the before and after performance, but start measuring and get those case studies that show this, document this improvement and demonstrate the ROI, so you can then spread the message. And as I mentioned, governance, and Guy mentioned, across the organization, figure out those people who, if you have their support, will make it easier for you to succeed. Get those people who, if you have their insight and wisdom, will make it easier to succeed. And find those people who, if they're invested in your success by being on the governance board, that this is a win for them, will be supportive when they might not normally be. These are the types of people that are strategic choices for governance that get them involved and available as part of the solution. Align your strategies with those functions, departments that you are in a place to support. Absolutely. And in some organizations, they have a central L&D department that supports everybody. Other organizations have separate L&D departments that support different units. So there's a sales L&D team and a marketing L&D team, or an operations L&D team. And some organizations have a hybrid. So they have a central group that works, and it can depend on what happens, but finding out, sharing the best practices from those groups, even if they're disparate, ends up working well. So it's a performance strategy is both how do you think internally and how do you work with those externally to start doing things in a performance way, and how do you get there? So I'm going to summarize what we've said today, and then I want to leave it open for questions, issues, challenges that we have as we finish up. So performance complements impact. What we at Upside have been talking about, we talked about impact was sort of a previous marketing campaign, not just doing learning, but showing that we're having an impact. And that impact comes from focusing on performance. So performance is a complement to impact. Critically, you got to focus on do. And any way to succeed in do, whether that's analyzing barriers outside L&D's remit and saying, look, you're hiring the wrong people. We don't do the hiring, but let me make clear that we have teams that aren't functional because people don't have the requisites, preparation and background to even be trained to be able to do what we need to do. And then when it is in remit, can a job aid do it? Can we help them perform with a job aid before we focus on developing courses? And then when we develop courses, do it right. So redo your design to focus on performance. Make sure that you're not just developing people's ability to know, but people on ability to do, and use whatever tools. If it's job aid, do the design right for that. If it's a performance, if it's a course, do the design right for that. And think system. Think in terms of, how do I do this collectively in an organized manner instead of disparate things that don't work and play well together? How do I, simple example is, many tasks are a combination of what we know in the head and the tools we have in the world. Have we developed our training to focus on including those tools so that together we're thinking about a systematic? And as was mentioned in the chat, how are we making sure we develop people on an ongoing basis? And how do we create a environment in which we have the tools and the people and the support to develop, and we're working, think systemically, not just individual tactics. You want to start thinking strategically. So that's really, to me, what I want to suggest about performance. And you've added wonderful things. Thank you. And at this point, I want to say thanks for being here. If any of this interests you, you should contact us at Upside Learning. You can go to the site, you can send us email, but also, what questions do you have? What does this raise for you? What barriers are you seeing to doing this? And maybe we can, answer it here. Hernan asks, what do you think about the methodology that Emma Weber proposes in turning learning into action for learning transfer? Emma in general talks about coaching in my mind. So she talks about a domain independent approach that sort of says, you know what you need to do, let's support you in enacting it. I think that's great. I think before that, you need to make sure that people have enough core requisite knowledge to be able to be supported in doing that. So to me, that's part of an adjunct to the initial development. Sometimes with job aids, that doesn't matter when you're developing new skills. However, you get people up to a certain speed, and then you need to support them and continue to develop. So building that coaching aspect in is great. I just think more. Madden, thanks. Very appreciate hearing that. Useful. So I hope that answered your question, Hernan. I'm a fan of Emma's, by the way, so I think what she says. You mentioned creating the right level of challenge. I'm aligned on this, but generally struggle with defining the right level. How would you recommend going about this? These are two things, really. The first one is make your first best guess and recognize that people will start with a little challenge and need more and more as they get better. So it's increasing. I would also suggest that you have to test it. You can't just do it a priori. You will make a good first guess, but you will refine it through testing and tuning that challenge to the right level as you progress. I just don't think it can be a one sweet. Guy says, thank you very much. Avoid the cult of behavior, which is when we address behaviors without understanding the accomplishments and how they are measured. Good point. Thank you, Guy, for the kind words, but also for that focus on making sure you don't just think about what you do, but what are the outputs that are needed. That's a good point in your book, and I appreciate it. Please show the book about pivot something. We'll put this in the show notes or something, but it's Guy Wallace's The L&D Pivot Point. And that pivot point he's talking about there is where you are looking at, should it be a course? Because too often that's the initial assumption, and the pivot point says, maybe it's not a course. Maybe we need to pivot to do something else. And that comes from your performance analysis up front. So it's a really good book talking about the analysis you need to do and the decisions you make as a basis of the analysis. So I hope it's available through LDA Press, and we'll get there. Thank you, okay, Lisa. Yes, great session. Thanks you very much. Any other questions, barriers, issues, comments? You have 3 minutes for some free answers to your questions or issues about this. I'm glad if it's valuable. You see, and in fact, I suppose we can turn off the slides and just go to the conversation, Isha. What do you think?
Yes, Clark, absolutely makes sense. And thank you for this insightful session. And I think a big thank you even goes out to our audience for being such a wonderful interactive bunch as usual. So we appreciate all of you joining the session from different parts of the world and contributing with your experience and insights. Like I mentioned in the chat, you could reach out to us at elearning@upsidelearning.com to share any feedback, suggestions, or just ask Clark any questions. So feel free to reach out over email if this is not the right time. But we'll still keep the chat window open for a couple of more minutes in case you have any parting comments or questions.
Yeah, and thank you all for attending, interacting, and your kind comments at the end. Very much appreciated. And thank you to Isha for producing and keeping us on track here.